Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to get back to business. And I have great pleasure in introducing Professor Constantin Zuckerman, who, as they always say, needs no introduction. One just has to say the word Byzantine Egypt, and the images of his great works on this subject come to mind. Many of us will be familiar with his part in the new edition, the French edition of 2020 of Constantine VII's Day Ceremonies, in which I think it's fair to say that Zuckerman was the driving force after, sadly, the old age and death of Professor Dagron. It was, I think, Zuckerman who pulled it together, and that edition, enormous editions, in the great tradition of French scholars who have edited Byzantine texts. And so it's perhaps surprising that he's now going to extend his range further still to 14th century Lithuania and tell us something of what is in the texts concerning Lithuania in Byzantine writings. So, over to you, Professor Zuckerman.
Thank you, Jonathan, for this very kind introduction. Too kind. I, of course, was not the driving force behind the French edition of the Book of Ceremonies. It was Professor Bernard Flouzin who picked up the project after the death of Gilbert Dagron, my teacher and the initiator of the project. And I promise not to say a word about Byzantine Egypt. My declared subject, which is in the program, which is behind my back, is Metropolitan Theognostos of Rosia and his struggle against the sees of Halitch and Lithuania. This is a vast subject which I will not cover. I would reformulate it as Metropolitan Theognostos of Rosia and his last struggle. And what we're going to discuss, and I hope we will discover, is whether it was against the See of Halitch or against the See of Lithuania, since this question is open. We will go into very small details, analyzing a document which has been known to all forever and has never been analyzed. Before, however, I would like to provide you with some background which led to the confrontation between the rivaling church jurisdictions in Eastern Europe. As you know, the original framework in the region was the Metropolitan See of Kiev, with the Metropolitan obviously located in Kiev. The last Metropolitan who actually sat in Kiev was Maximus, a Greek, who, after another Mongol devastation of Kiev, moved his see to Vladimir on Klazma, probably in 1299. That's the most commonly cited date. This is well known. This move was not coordinated with the Patriarch. And this move opened over half a century of struggle between the Metropolitan See of Kiev, which was no longer in Kiev, and the Greek Patriarchs. This is a very important background. The next step, which occurred just a few years after the move of the Metropolitan See to Vladimir, was the creation of the Metropolitan See in Halitch. The creation of Metropolitan See in Halitch, generally dated around 1303, is studied in various political contexts. Different explanations are being provided for this step. I will not speculate on the causes, But I will emphasize what has not been duly emphasized in the scholarly literature, and to which extent this was a violation of the church tradition as established for a century beforehand. Not a single metropolitan see has been broken since times immemorial. This was a totally exceptional step, and this is very important for understanding the logic of the actors whom I'm going to describe. The patriarch, we're not even sure who it was, but it doesn't matter. The patriarch broke an established metropolitan see in two, separating the see of Rosia into Megali and Micre Rosia, the later being seated in Halitch. I don't know what could be the influence of the local authorities in Halitch on this step. I see it essentially as an expression of displeasure by the patriarch with the act of Metropolitan Maximus. However, we explain it, the exceptional character of this step is uncontestable. The first Metropolitan of Halitch was a certain Nifont, whom we essentially know by name. What happened next? The Metropolitans of Halitch and of Kiev in Vladimir on Klasma, that is Nifont and Maximus, died about the same time. They died about the same time. We know that Maximus died on December 6, 1305. The exact date of Nifont's death is not known. What we do know is that a Russian successor for the Greek Metropolitan Maximus was sent to Constantinople and rejected as unworthy. The successor for Nifont was equally sent to Constantinople. Expectedly enough, it was, in modern term, Ukrainian, in ancient term, Volhynian, a certain Peter, a Volhynian monk, who was appointed successor of Nifont. He was appointed successor of Nifont. This Peter, despite his Ukrainian roots, and instead of going to Halitch in his native Volhynia, went to Vladimir on Klasma, from where he moved the Metropolitan See to Moscow in 1325, and thus became the founder of Moscow Church, declared saint very, very soon after his death by his successor Theognostos. That is, we can speculate on reasons for Peter's lack of Ukrainian patriotism, but what I would like to emphasize again is that church has a logic of its own. That is, as any of the actors whom I will mention, I'm sure that Peter did not recognize the division of the Metropolitan See. And therefore, he aspired for the Metropolitan See in its entirety. And that's why he went to the legitimate seat of the Metropolitan of Kiev, which at the time was Vladimir on Klasma. Well, I am just describing the context. I am not trying to reason or to seek psychology of personalities involved. Peter moved the see from Vladimir to Moscow in 1325 and died a year and a half later in December 1326. For the Church of Constantinople, which still tried to push its own political line, despite what was happening on the ground, this was the occasion to put an order in the Eastern affairs. Therefore, on Peter's death, two metropolitans were appointed. Again, one for Kiev, because they didn't recognize the move to Vladimir, one for Kiev and one for Halitch. And the one who was appointed as Metropolitan of Kiev was a Greek, Theognostos, who never set his foot in Russia beforehand. And then, and this is also something that hasn't been duly emphasized, the Greek Theognostos all of a sudden became an incredible Russian patriot. Instead, he moved ahead of his Halitchian counterpart Gabriel, but instead of going either to Kiev or to Vladimir and Klasma, he went to Volhynia. He went to Volhynia not in order to occupy the see of Halitch, of course, to which he had no aspiration, but in order to consecrate local bishops. And he spent nearly a year in Volhynia before even occupying his see, nominating local bishops, and thus actually pulling the rug out from under the feet of his coming colleague and Western counterpart Gabriel, because all the bishops appointed was committed to him. The succession of Gabriel, who is just a name known from a single mention, in Halitch was totally compromised by this preventive action of Theognostos in Volhynia, who then, of course, proceeded to Moscow, where the seat was located, and during his entire term exercised his authority over both Volhynia and Russia. The interesting question is why in 1328 Theognostos was allowed to act that way. This is a question to the specialist in Lithuanian history, because by that time it's very difficult to find out what was the exact political structure of the region at the time. But clearly, the Lithuanian Duke Gediminas, who was the Duke at the time, was probably indifferent. That is, I think it's what I skipped in describing the history of the Metropolitan of Halitch was to mention the creation of the Metropolitan See in Lithuania, which Jonathan mentioned briefly, which occurred between 1315 and 1317. That is about the time when the Duke Vytenis, Gediminas' predecessor, died. His death is dated around 1316. I couldn't see why it's 16, not 15, but doesn't matter. It's clear that the creation of the Metropolitan See in Lithuania was negotiated by Vytenis. It must have been a long negotiation. And here again, there is a small point that deserves to be made. This appointment must have occurred against the background of promised conversion. Simply because we have no precedent of Byzantines appointing a metropolitan into a pagan country with no prospect of conversion. There are very few parallels for appointing metropolitans into pagan countries. There was a project which was never realized of creating a metropolitan see in Khazari in the 9th century, which fell through. There was a metropolitan see created in Abkhazia with the assurance of conversion, which didn't work out, but it's a process which started and which was then erased by the Arabs. I can't believe that wasn't. I would have time believing that wasn't the case with Vytenis, who must have given promises to the Byzantines in order to obtain the creation of the Metropolitan See. And the metropolitan was appointed. The metropolitan was appointed, but there is but this metropolitan named Theophilus only appears in Greek sources which attest him in Constantinople. I have strong doubts that he ever left Constantinople and ever went to Lithuania, because I suspect that Gediminas, when he came to power, didn't show any interest in his presence, and this lack of interest also reflects in his tolerance for the exceptionally partisan action of Theognostos 10 years later in Volhynia. In 1347, the Prince of Moscow, through the intermediary of Theognostos, made a major contribution mentioned by Jonathan to the reconstruction of the Church of Saint Sophia. And at the end of this year, the newly appointed Emperor John VI Cantacuzénos abolished the Halitch Metropolitan See. This is very rare. This is a very rare act because Byzantines rarely bothered to officially abolish non-vacant metropolitan sees. For example, after the death of Theophilus, the Metropolitan See of Lithuania remained vacant. That is, it simply wasn't filled. The Metropolitan See of Halitch was officially abolished, that we know from a good source, and it seemed that Metropolitan Theognostos had a total success, and he probably expected to enjoy his victory to the end of his days, except that he had a surprise. There was a certain challenge to his authority in the person of the mysterious Metropolitan Theodoratos. Metropolitan Theodoratos is a very mysterious figure in the Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and Russian history, and in fact, the aim of my talk is to somehow disperse this mystery. Why is this figure so mysterious? Metropolitan Theodoratos is known from only 3 mentions in the sources. One of these mentions in the Nikon Chronicle, a very complex text from the early 16th century, informed on many points, which says that he was installed in Kiev in 1352. Well, since he was installed in Kiev, it's admitted, believed, and uncontestable that he was a creature of the Lithuanian Duke Algirdas, who controlled Kiev at the time, and who, unlike his predecessor Gediminas, understood that not only Catholic Christianity, but also Orthodox Christianity matters for his political aims, and decided to play on this arena as well. The Metropolitan Theodoratos was installed in Kiev totally against the position of the ecumenical patriarchs. How we know about that? We know about that from the 2 other sources that mention him. And these 2 sources are a letter by Philotheos Kokinos to Moses, the bishop of Novgorod, who will be the central figure of my talk. But before I go to Moses, I will just mention the contents of these letters. The Patriarch in 2 letters insists that Moisei should not recognize Theodoratus. Recognize in which capacity? That is the biggest question that has been asked, and answers suggested by John Meindorf, the big authority for the period, who produced very valuable studies, suggested that perhaps he was installed as the Metropolitan of Kiev in Kiev, and to that extent, the Archbishop Moisei was warned not to recognize him as his direct hierarchical superior. Meindorf went even further in his analysis. He pointed out that the letters to Moisei date from 1354, that is 2 years after the installation of Theodoratus in Kiev. And they say that we already warned you not to recognize this Theodoratus. And this insisting and this persistent warnings show, and I agree with this analysis, show that Moses did recognize Theodoratus. We will see why, but that he did recognize him. But again, in what capacity? Could he recognize him as his direct hierarchical superior? This is absurd. What would he do? He would exclude Theognostos from the mention at liturgy and mention Theodoratus instead. That would be a scandal. That we would know from Chronicles, that would be in other sources. And besides, he didn't break the communion with Theodoratus. They had very bad relations, but they didn't break. So Moisei recognized Theodoratus, but as I say, the question is in which capacity? In order to answer this question, we need to turn to this Archbishop Moisei. Not much is known about him. Archbishop Moisei was a creation of Metropolitan Peter. Metropolitan Peter consecrated him in not long before his death, in 1325. Then, in 1329, the new Metropolitan Theodoratus visited Novgorod. Then, the next year, very, very soon, Archbishop Moisei felt a sudden urge for calm and serenity, and he abandoned his archbishopric and retired to a monastery. As the Chronicle says emphatically, of his own volition. When we have such an emphatic statement, we might suspect that it was not exactly the case, and in fact we have the proof that it was not. Because in 1352, Moisei's successor, appointed by Theognostos, Vasily Kalika, died. We should imagine this is the first outbreak of the Black Death in Europe, where in the very worst period everybody is dying, like our COVID, but nobody pays attention because they think that's how it is. They still don't know that that's the great Black Death that will devastate Europe. Vasily Kalika died, and the people of Novgorod brought back on the archbishop's see Moisei from his monastery. This was totally against canons, because he resigned, because he gave up, because he retired, and because they did not consult the Metropolitan Theognostos. But here there is a very small canonical detail. It was illegal and non-canonical unless he was removed from his see against his will. This is a fine point which in church history returns quite often. when a patriarch that was chased from his throne and who had to resign wants to come back, he says, no, 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 no. When I was kind of leaving St. Sophia, I whispered, and I'm doing it against my will. It was not voluntary. So I would put it that way. For Moisei's return to be canonically accepted, he must have thought and he must have declared that he retired against his will. Otherwise, this would not be allowed. Obviously, the relations between the old and new Archbishop of Novgorod and his Metropolitan were spoiled forever. No, forever, not for so long, because very soon Theognostos will die, but they still didn't know that this happy outcome will resolve the problem. But so the relations were very bad, and Moisei was complaining against his patriarch to Constantinople, and the responses from the patriarchs, it was Callistus and then Philoteikos, were dealing with the conflict between him and his patriarch. That's why the recognition of some kind of competing metropolitan was logical against this background. This is in open sources. And now we need to turn to sources that have never been exploited because of their obscure character and their sheer dryness. Those are the lists that are part of all the chronicle compilation in Russia. There are different lists. There are lists of dukes or high princes. There are lists of Novgorod Posadniki. There are lists of metropolitans. But there are also lists of Novgorod archbishops. And the lists of it has been shown that the most ancient list of Novgorod archbishops stands somehow in relation to our Archbishop Moisei, because it ends with David, his predecessor, who obviously died in 1325 when he was himself appointed. Horoshev, who analyzed this list, said that yes, it could be either composed by Moisei himself during his first term, or by his successor, Vasily Kalika, during his term, who could not mention in the list Moisei, because this is list serving for commemoration, because Moisei was still alive. I, in provisional manner, suggest a different hypothesis. This list could be composed by Moisei during his second term, in order not to include Vasily Kalika and to show that he was not occupying his see legally, that he was not that he was an intruder and not a legal occupier of Novgorod Archbishopric, because otherwise the return of Moisei himself to his see would be against the canons. But on this list we will not dwell, because there is another series of lists in this inserts, appendices to chronicles. They appear in different positions. They're, as I say, they're very dry, they're rarely studied. And one of the best known of these lists is the lists of the bishoprics of the Metropolitan See of Rosia, or Rus. Let me show you this. We have on the left found in a chronicle that is preserved in Warsaw, and all our Polish friends can run and admire it, if it deserves admiration. The lists that I want to discuss more in detail are all from Novgorod tradition. No, as you know, much of our chronicle material is of Novgorod tradition. That is, on the right, you have the most widespread list. It's in many chronicles, and the most ancient appearance that are reproduced is in so-called Novgorodsko-Karamzinskaya Chronica first collection. We will not go into the definition of this compilation. The main thing is that it's, well, again, if we don't go into details, it's fairly well dated from the first 20 years of the 15th century. This list is, as I say, the most common version of the bishoprics. It's so-called list of 22 bishoprics because they are numbered. One thing to know about the lists of bishoprics, whether in Byzantium or in Rus, is that after the initial kernel, which is not chronological and which reflects just the state of the bishoprics, at the moment of the list composition, all the new additions are in chronological order. And so here we have very firm chronological market, which is the bishoprics of Kolomna. The bishopric of Kolomna was created by Theognostos just before his death. He died in 1353, so it was probably created in 1352, but it was probably officialized in 1354 because, and that's a very important technical point, church authorities had no authority to create bishoprics. In Byzantine canonic law, this right belonged exclusively to the emperor. Only emperors could create new ecclesiastical dioceses of whatever level. So it was no doubt officialized in 1354 when Theognostos' successor, Alexei, was appointed in Constantinople. And the list in the middle appears only in one source, which is the Novgorod First Chronicle of so-called Younger Reduction under the year 989. And as you see, this list is not only shorter, but it's also strangely lacunary. There are positions missing. Well, no one ever asks the question why there are positions missing, and what are these positions? This is why I chose to pose the two lists in this way. And the first thing that you see is that the list of Novgorod Chronicle does not have Kolomna. It doesn't have Kolomna. So it has a terminus antiquum of 1354, to be sure. It will be too long to explain why the bishoprics of Suzdal and Sarai do not count. I don't think that I have that much time. Jonathan, I have still 5 minutes. So
yeah, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah. But if you want, you can afterwards ask the question why they don't count, and I will explain. What is important is actually the missing elements in the list of the Novgorod First Chronicle that are not continuous, which are not continuous. Look at this very nicely positioned bishopric of Yuriev. If you just read the missing positions, this is the list of the Metropolitan, this is the composition of the Metropolitan See of Halitch. And no one can convince me that just by chance someone dropped Halitch, then decided not to drop Yuriev, and went on to drop Peremysh, Lutsk, Omsk, and Turov, and then continued copying Rostov and the rest. You see, this is the list which I would definitely connect, like the list of the archbishops of Novgorod with Archbishop Moisei, because what it shows is simply the recognition of the Metropolitan See of Halitch. Strictly, precisely. That is, you can say why Vladimir, but that can also be left as a question. The answer is that when I transliterate the same Volodymyrskaya, in one case I transliterate it as Vladimir, and in other case I translate it as Volodymyr Volinsky. So it was not understood as the same city, but that requires some explanation, which is quite straightforward. However, I can point out that this list simply shows the recognition of the Metropolitan See of Halitch as determined by the Byzantine Church. That's what is missing. And that is what the Archbishop Moisei obviously recognized. He couldn't recognize the Theodoretos as Metropolitan of Kiev, and he was not a Metropolitan of Kiev. He was, that is, the church maneuver that was put in place by Duke Algirdas with the collaboration of anonymous Patriarch of Turnva consisted in reviving, for the purposes of the Lithuanian prince, the freshly abolished Metropolitan See of Halitch, with all its bishoprics. And it's in this position that Theodoretos was appointed. This understanding is very important for the explanation of the subsequent negotiations between the Lithuanians that led to the revival of the Lithuanian Metropolitan See under Metropolitan Romanos. But that will be another topic, because I think I exhausted my time. But this point is important because this connects this episode directly to the history of Lithuania, and I hope that it will deserve a place in the new edition of the monumental volume produced by Darius and Stephen Rowell, which, as far as could see, does not feature Theodoretos, and yet he deserves half a page as actor who served Lithuanian politics and then was sacrificed by Algirdas for a more satisfactory solution, which consisted in creating a vastly expanded Metropolitan See of Lithuania in 1354. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Constantin, for this masterly exposition of the appearance and disappearance of Halitch and indeed of the Lithuanian Metropolitan, which was very clear and which ended with this brilliant example of the writing out of the historical record of an inconvenient institution, which brings us back to the exarch's talk about the mastery of the past, control of the past, in his introductory address. I think there may well be questions, but I'd suggest we have questions at the end after the next paper.